I'm delighted to welcome back Linda Falcone. Linda has spoken in the Wednesday lecture programs off and on over the years on a number of things. Linda is best known as the director of Advancing Women's Artists, which has done fantastic work in restoring important works in Florence by women as artists, as getting them much better known, better understood within the canon of Florentine art. Before that, she did a lot of teaching, and she's also a writer on all things to do with Italian life and literature. And tonight she's going to tell us the story of how the English colony saved the city. So, over to you.
It has such a ring to it, doesn't it? That how the English colony saved the city. How can we go wrong with that? Thank you, Simon, for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure, and to see a lot of friendly faces and friends tuning in, and new friends tuning in as well. So this talk tonight, which is called Fighting Spirits, is part of a program called the Oltrarno Gaze, and it's a program that we have brought forward over the past couple of months. And Simon invited me a couple months back to talk about Vernon Lee. And it's quite a privilege to be able to talk about her in one of her homes, which is the British Institute, because she has one of her book collections at the Institute. And it's a collection with her notes in the margins and the dates in which she read the different books, and her different thoughts about what she was reading, etc. So I really am very happy to be here today to talk about this fighting spirit, who was actually a pacifist writer, one of the most important early 20th century pacifist writers. And the fact that she was anti-militarist was, let's say, one of the reasons she doesn't have the renown today that one would expect, considering how very prolific and very well respected she was in her day. She spent a lot of her time in Florence, and actually lived in Florence until her death, until 1935. So nonetheless, right, she was a fighting spirited pacifist. And I hope that today, because I know that a lot of people tuning in, or some people tuning in, are actual experts on Vernon Lee, I would like to open the conversation after our talk for their insight on this very interesting and on some level difficult figure to understand and to interpret, particularly in 1 hour, because she was really so varied in her production and in her different philosophies. So I'm hoping that you can, let's see. You can see the slides, and here we have Vernon Lee at Il Palmerino, along with the present day owners of Il Palmerino, Federica Paretti and Stefano Vinceri. They are the spirit of the place, the genus loci. And I put them here, and I'll have to apologize to Federica afterwards for putting this private photo that was taken a couple of years ago. But I wanted to include it because of a conversation that we had the other day about Vernon Lee, in which Federica said, è molto difficile da biografare. So she's very difficult to biographize or to describe. I wanted to sort of give this description to Henry James, who was a friend of Vernon Lee. And if you can see the slide, his take on who she was and on her character was a word of warning about Vernon Lee, because she is as dangerous and uncanny as she is intelligent, which is saying a great deal. Her vigor and sweep are most rare, and her talk superior altogether. She is far away the most able mind in Florence. So that's where we're starting. We're starting with the most able mind in Florence. And I really wanted to, with you, get to the heart of the matter, which is the fact that Vernon Lee created a deliberate outcry, which was sparked when she published an impassioned letter in a newspaper to the mayor, Piero Torrigiani, but not in La Nazione, not in Florence's local paper or in Italy's national papers, but in the London Times. And in this letter dated the 5th of December, 1898, she wanted to draw attention to a particular issue, which is the flood of modernization that was taking the city by storm. So what we're going to be looking at today is really her personal activism, this act of personal activism to the benefit of the city. And this is something that I know is very close to the heart of many people who are listening in, particularly those who are working in culture and the preservation of culture. Vernon Lee called this modernization self-mutilation, and immediately her expat Malou, so we can imagine John Singer Sargent and Lawrence Tadema and Walter Crane, for example, her friend, the novelist Edith Wharton, several of whom had visited with her at Palmerino, where they talked about ideas and economics and literature, philosophy, etc. A lot of their writing and a lot of their pictures were linked to Florence and the creation of Florence's mystique. So really they were right at the foot of the cannon with Vernon Lee in terms of this issue, because they didn't want a single brick of their adoptive city to be damaged. And that's really where we start. This is a piazza that you'll know and recognize, Piazza della Repubblica, and we have obviously the modernization mania that Vernon Lee was referring to was linked to plans that were drafted with the unification of Italy, particularly by an architect called Giuseppe Poggi during Florence's 5-year stint as the capital of Italy. Now, imagine that a lot of reurbanization plans were brought to fruition during this time, but that its stint as capital lasted so little. It was only 5 years. And so what you had at the end of it was a rather traumatized city that had been trying with all its might to, in some way, transform itself into a European capital. And Poggi's plan was really aimed at making Florence a new kind of Paris. So you can imagine a lot of boulevards and bigger piazzas, bigger squares, etc. And if you look at the medieval center of Florence and all of its alleys and small veicoli and piazzette, that should still, right, even far down the line, many years later, it should still sort of worry us, this plan. This idea of creating a Parisian feel was linked to 37 reorganization or reurbanization plans that were presented to the city of Florence, and one of them included the demolition of the Ponte Vecchio. We often talk about Hitler saving the Ponte Vecchio because he was a tourist in Florence prior World War II, and he loved the Ponte Vecchio, etc. So he didn't basically destroy it during the Nazi invasion. However, we really do have to credit Vernon Lee for her efforts. And it's a story that's not well known in the least. And which is really one of the reasons why Simon made this invitation, so that we could on some level recover this hidden story of this expat who was Vernon Lee. The plans were going to demolish a part of Palazzo Davanzati, destroy an area that went to Via Periceria, to the Ponte Vecchio, destroy part of the Palazzo di Parte Guelfa, for example, the Church of San Biagio, and other landmarks. So you can really imagine what level of destruction we're talking about. The Piazza della Repubblica has never, in the Florentine mindset, enjoyed too much renown or too much love. For those of Vernon Lee's time, and particularly for the expats, they really considered it a modern horror. I don't know if the up and coming generations see the piazza in that light, but they really thought that it was very much out of character and almost a violence to the city, and Vernon Lee called it self-mutilation. Here we have, I wanted to talk to you a little about the demolition before the battle of our fighting spirit. And, we know that Piazza della Repubblica was steeped in controversy. And in fact, Mayor Tommaso Corsini stepped down because of his inability to stop the process. We're talking about the demolition of the ghetto. We're talking about the demolition of the Mercato Vecchio, for example. And here is a painting of the time of the Mercato Vecchio, as you can see, very brimming with life on all levels. Because of this demolition, pre-Vernon Lee's involvement, we're looking at the loss of 26 ancient streets, 20 squares of various sizes, 18 alleys, 341 residential buildings, and about 450 workshops. So almost 2,000 families who lost their homes and were distanced from the neighborhood, which equals about 6,000 people. Just to give you some statistics, which will help us get a better understanding of actually what we're talking about. And here we have the demolition of the area and the demolition of the Mercato Nuovo area. In fact, if you look at the different arcades at the very back of the picture on the right-hand side, you'll recognize that. Those who know Florence well will recognize that arcade as one that is now in Piazza dei Ciompi. So on some level, the ruins were replaced in other areas of the city, but really we are looking at a very destructive moment. What happened was Vernon Lee took up her pen, and as journalist Maurizio Naldini pointed out, her decision to write to the London Times was almost an act of globalization, because she got signatures and support and advocacy from various countries throughout Europe and the United States. So Russia, France, London, Berlin. First, she started with the city administrators, then she rallied the Londoners, and then finally she went to, she began to speak with the intelligentsia all over Europe. And it was actually quite an incredible case, because she gathered 11,000 signatures, and you can imagine what it would have meant at that time with no social media and really no globalized communication. To gather 11,000 signatures for the cause is essentially the reason that Naldini is talking about one of the first cases of globalization, also in a context in which we're looking at a newly unified Italy. We're looking at European powers that are rather divided, and each of these European powers that are looking for sovereignty in their own way. So it was very interesting to see all of these different people coming together, and we have some really interesting names that were involved in the outreach, and we can talk about famous Italians like Giuseppe Verdi or Giosuè Carducci, but also names from abroad like Cosima Wagner. Theodore Roosevelt was among the signers before he was president, and obviously some very important foreign figures, expat figures who were living in Florence. And we can remember Herbert Horn, who was obviously, as you know, a very important collector and very interested in conserving the various traditions of Florence. The same can be said of Frederick Stiebert, for example, but others as well, like Sarah Bernhardt and Rudyard Kipling. We had, for example, the New York governor, James Beaufort, or Rodin. So really from all walks of knowledge, painters and writers and sculptors, etc., who on some level believed that Florence belongs to all of humanity. And I think this is something that we as a modern day audience are still very interested in and still very touched by, very connected to. Even John Temple, leader who reconstructed the villa at Vinciliata, was a very prominent member of an organization that was mostly Italian, which was the Defense of Old Florence. And we have Corsini as the president, and Vernon Lee was the only woman member of this organization. Obviously the reaction, and it took Vernon Lee some time after the publication of her letter, 3 days after its publication. So it was published on the 15th of December in 1898, and 3 days after, the mayor, Torrigiani, with whom she had had an interview to discuss the issue, really would scold Corsini for his association, the Defense of Ancient Florence, or the Defense of Old Florence. And he would scold him for the foreign advocacy that was basically all riled up and furious about this destruction, or these plans for destruction. And what the mayor's response was to Corsini was, I panni sporchi si lavano in casa. So we wash our dirty laundry at home. But I think that it's relevant, particularly even to the expat community today, because a lot of times throughout history, we have seen how it does often take a foreign eye to see the city, and this idea of really protectionism of the city, and how really fundamental the quote unquote English colony was for, as Simon was saying, for saving Florence, but also for creating the image of Florence that we are relating to today, and that we continue to relate to via what we call 19th century spectacles, because all of these writers and poets and painters that we're discussing played a fundamental role in reviving Florence and rediscovering Florence. And these are things that I like to think can still happen. I think that the discovery is something of today. It's not simply something that we can study from Vernon Lee's time. So while Vernon Lee was going global, she was also going grassroots. She wanted a grassroots movement, and she was very strategic in how she pushed forward this initiative. On the one hand, because she understood the importance of journalism, and she understood the importance of foreign journalism. although the Nazione was a very respectable paper at the time and probably had more importance in the late 1800s than it does today, today it's more of a local publication. She really understood how powerful the pen would be for bringing this issue into the public eye. And rather than trying to do sort of an arm wrestling battle with the administrators of the city, she took the stance that administrators come and go. So, perhaps had she tried to convince the administrators behind closed doors, one administrator might agree and then go out of office, and she would find herself with the same problem. I mean, obviously, as we said before, if you're looking at 37 plans to revamp the city, you need backup, so to speak. And what she wanted to do, and I'll read, what she actually says in her letter, and I would recommend, if you have the possibility, to read it in its entirety. It's quite long. But what she says is, every means should be taken to educate the taste and historic spirit of the small bourgeoisie, the working people, and it should be made clear to every class, directly or indirectly interested in the presence of foreigners, that one of the chief attractions of the city is its well-preserved medieval character. The slide that I'm sharing with you here is from the late 1800s, and it's called La Moda. It's by Antonio Puccinelli. It's almost cartoon-like, almost a caricature that suggests to us that fashions are fickle. This is an ideal Florence, so we're not sure which street he was actually trying to depict. But what Vernon Lee is saying, and what she does say in her letter, is that there's a great interest, particularly from the tourists and from the foreign community, in the medieval center, in the Renaissance ideals of Florence. And should city administrators not respect that sentiment, the foreign presence can very easily go to Siena, very easily go to Perugia, find equally beautiful and well-preserved treasures. And she also says the weather in the Riviera, the climate in the Riviera, is in any case far superior. So this interest in tourism and in the economic aspect of Florence and protecting the economic future of Florence was an area, I believe, or I would suggest, in which she would be heard. And I do want to take us back another century, at least, more than another century, to the family pact and to Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, who, as you know, is the last Medici heir, because I couldn't help, in reading Vernon Lee's letter, to think about Anna Maria Luisa, who died without an heir. She was obviously in danger of having all of the Medici property become part of the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty, and could very easily have been sold off to solve the problems of the indebted Austrians. And so what she created, as you know, and just as a reminder, is the family pact, in which she established that art in the city would not be sold off piece by piece, but that it would have to remain in the city to ornament the state, to benefit the public, and to attract the curiosity of foreigners. So this issue is, I think it's worth it for us to talk about that, to talk about how important it was to attract the foreign presence. And I also put here, so you can enjoy this photograph of the demolition of the area near the Vecchio Mercato, and this wonderful image of Athena, who, as we know, is the patron of artists, and she is looking out among the rubble, which I think is really significant, a really significant and evocative image. But on some level, we do have to think of Florence as a female city, a city that was and has been protected by women throughout its history. And we can talk about it during the discussion afterwards, but I really do think that it is to women's credit that the city has all of the treasures, still has all of the treasures that we enjoy today. Henry James speaks of foreigners, the forestieri, and says that they were scatterers of cash. And to quote him, a quote that I think is really relevant, he said, "Should they cease to arrive, and the turnstiles at the doors of the old palaces and convents, with the little patented slit for absorbing your half-franc would go rusty and would stiffen with disuse." So there is this idea in any case that the foreign presence is bringing economic wealth. And on some level, I think it's at the core of why Vernon Lee was actually successful, because obviously economy is a language that city administrators can understand, if not culture. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, first of all, this idea of Florence through 19th century spectacles, but also why the so-called English colony felt such a right, quote unquote, to get riled up about the future of Florence. When we talk about gli Inglesi, the English in Florence, we also have to reflect on the fact that in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, the Florentines used the word Inglesi or English to basically talk about any foreigner. And there was a huge influx of Inglesi, real Inglesi, particularly the poets. So the Brownings, Keats, Byron, Shelley, etc. And it became a paradise, almost a paradise for exiles. And to quote Francesca Baldi, who says, "Rivers of ink have been devoted to describing the idyllic capital of Italy, the idyllic Florentia, and the expatriates who were looking at its architecture, its surrounding landscape, the ubiquitous nature of its Renaissance art." So there was this revival. On the one hand, a lot of Inglesi were escaping from the modernization of their own countries. Right now, just to talk to you about the slide, we're looking at Casa Guidi, and as you know, the Brownings, and Elizabeth in particular, was very interested in what she called the Italian cause. And so this idea of Italy as a unified nation. As you know, Italy was a very divided peninsula with all of its republics, etc. And it's quite a young nation. So we have in the mid 1860s, its unification. And something interesting that you can see about Casa Guidi is that it was decorated in the colors of the then illegal Italian flag. So that's why you're seeing the greens and the reds, which also are very prominently featured in the frescoes that you can see in various areas of Florence, particularly the Old Trarno, for example. Obviously, Elizabeth Barrett Browning comes a bit earlier than our scenario, than Vernon Lee's scenario, but I do want to use it to set the stage for a situation in which, as Elizabeth wrote, we could live like the Grand Duke with 500 a year. So this idea that there was huge freedom, huge economic freedom, the labor was basically to have live-in servants was not expensive at all. In the Brownings' time in Florence, it was very popular to live in the in-city palazzo. They were a couple of paces, in her words, they were a couple of paces from the Pitti Palace. And there was immense freedom. Another thing I want to discuss with you is that there was really immense freedom for gli Inglesi who would come to Florence, because a lot of times they didn't feel it was necessary to sort of obey by the same social mores or moral mores than they would have had been forced to adhere to in their own countries. And I think this is really important. I'm thinking about a quote by Elizabeth Browning that says she really admired the sculptress Harriet Hosmer, because, as Elizabeth writes, she dines and breakfasts in cafes precisely as a young man would, which is quite interesting. It's quite interesting to think of that being sort of what to admire about this very famous and prolific sculptress who was working in Rome with the woman who James called the white Marmorian flock. He's I can't resist quoting him every so often as I talk to you, because he really had so many sort of almost vignette-like words to describe his relationship to Florence, or his perspective on Florence. But returning to Vernon Lee, this discussion that we're having does beg the question: was she the quintessential expat? And it is important to look at Vernon Lee's relationship with Florence. We need to remember that she didn't actually grow up in England. She had a very international childhood, and her family spent her childhood traveling through Europe. And so she did speak, I believe it was 5 languages. If not 5, it's 4. And there's an interesting quote by a friend of hers, Marchesa Nerini Medici Gigliucci, who says that Vernon Lee understood the Italians, not just in translation, but in the original. And she was accepted by the Italians, young and old, not as a foreign admirer or an onlooker, but as an actual participant. And this is something that is very rare for the English colony or community. There was, we could say, a handful who were in discussions with the Italians of the day, and even less who were interested in sort of the social the ferment, the social agonies is the only word that comes to me of the Italians, who obviously were living a very different reality than the idyllic sort of room with a view idea. So Vernon Lee was really in love with Italy. She didn't have a solely idealist view. She believed that history had a lot to do with perspective, and that history was not actually the study of truth, but the study of a viewpoint, which perhaps today could seem obvious to us, but it was rather revolutionary in terms of mentality. And what she does say is, for all my interest in England, Italy is my country. And I think I'd be curious to ask those tuning in, how many people actually feel that way, that they feel, this connection to Italy. Certainly, as a loyal expat Florentine, the Florentines will be happy to know that she was not initially sold on Rome. She said, for example, that, well, she called Rome a dreary, horrible city of the popes. And as we know, since there is such a rivalry, continues to be such a rivalry between the Florentines and the Romans, even today, I'm sure that the Florentines tuning in will be very happy to know where Vernon Lee's first loyalties lied. But going back to this idea of freedom in Italy, that was achieved in Italy and particularly Florence, I wanted to just suggest to you that particularly for women, they were able to find a creative space in Italy, probably more so than their own countries. And it was almost a precursor, if we're looking at the late Victorian era, to what Virginia Woolf would later call a room of her own. Here we have a hotel room by John Sargent, and right next to it is a painting by Michele Tedesco, who is one of the Macchiaoli painters, of painters Francesco Saverio Altamura and Jane Benham Hay in the garden. I just wanted to say something really quick about Jane Benham Hay. In this case, we're talking about the mid-1800s. She was interested in advocating for the Italian cause, just like Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And we see her painting here, the Florentine Procession. And you'll notice that it's actually a procession depicting the bonfire of the vanities. And so this group of Florentines are going to abandon or sacrifice their lavish possessions. So it's quite interesting how this revival of the Florentine ideal, particularly linked to medieval and Renaissance stories and images, etc., are the way we relate to Florence today. And obviously the pre-Raphaelites are very involved in this idea of the Florence mystique, etc. But Benham Hay, you see that she, in the mid-1850s, abandons her new husband, set off for Florence with their child in tow, and teamed up with Altamura, had several other children with him, etc., and was completely accepted in the milieu of the expat community of Florence. A little bit later, I mean, I do want to mention and remember that in 1928, D.H. Lawrence actually published the first edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover privately in Florence, because the British censorship had banned this account of adulterous love. So there was freedom not only for women, but for creative individuals in general. And I think that's a very important element to discuss, particularly because I'm sure that it was relevant to Vernon Lee's experience as well up at Palmerino. Now, if we're looking at the Florence mystique or the Tuscan mystique, here we have some paintings by John Singer Sargent again. They were friends. He and Vernon Lee were childhood friends, and they actually met when she was 12 years old and had a lifelong friendship. These are images that are very dreamlike, lovely images. And a little bit later in his, well, actually, no, pretty much at the same time that these were being painted, you had Henry James in Italian Hours saying that if one is an aching alien, half the talk is of villas. So for the price of a good painting, you could essentially buy an entire villa, purchase an entire villa, garden, and surrounding estate, which meant that quote unquote outcasts of all nationalities could then go to these villas, they would gain standing, social standing, by buying the villas of old Florentine nobles and insert themselves in these spaces and then restore them, refurbish them, etc. So there was this huge shift that we were seeing from city living or hotel living, pension living, to villa living. And for example, when we're talking about the myth and the images of Italy and Florence, we have to mention Edith Wharton, right? Obviously in her Italian villas and their gardens. And in order to create this book, she said she would be forever indebted to Vernon Lee, because it was Vernon Lee who actually opened the doors for her to view all of the villas in Florence and in Rome as well. Let's see. So, for example, we can take the example of Villa Castellani in Bellosguardo. We're talking about a 50-room villa that was created in the 15th century. And it certainly offered a room of her own to Elizabeth Booth, painter, whose alter ego Henry James would capture in Portrait of a Lady. So she filled the place with her pre-Raphaelite friends that were also students of her husband, the American painter Frank Duveneck. And I just wanted to mention one example for you. We have here Mary Spartali Stillman. She was both maker and muse, model to a lot of the pre-Raphaelite painters. And she's familiar, perhaps even for those who have never seen an image of her before or seen her art before. We certainly, she was immortalized by the vast majority of the Brotherhood's best, quote unquote. And finally, she persuaded her reluctant father to allow her to train with Ford Madox Brown, and ended up having productive careers in both Florence and Rome. Her journalist husband was stationed in Rome, and she ended up producing over 170 works. Here we have Fiammetta telling the story of the Decameron, telling the story to her companions in the framework of the Decameron, when this young comitiva of wealthy individuals escaped the city during the plague and told each other stories in the 10 days of the Decameron. So you see, and a lot of the pre-Raphaelite imagery, will either be representing Dante or Boccaccio or Beatrice, so Beatrice, etc. And we have a very Botticelli-like feel to a lot of her paintings, but obviously Botticelli was sort of the epitome of almost a spiritual, certainly in terms of aesthetics, he was the benchmark for the pre-Raphaelites. And this was something new because the Florentines were not fond of him. So it really was these painters' interest, also the interest of critics, and Bernard Berenson is one of them, for example, who I always like to remember the story of the birth of Venus being in the deposits. It's really a source of inspiration for us at Advancing Women Artists to have, again, the foreign eye recognize the value of an artist and bring that artist to the fore by attention, by targeted attention. So I think we do have to think of this idea, why did the Inglesi get so riled up about Florence, about the destruction of Florence? They were the city's storytellers. They were interested in revitalizing the Renaissance. They considered, particularly for the Victorians, they considered the Renaissance almost a mirror image of their own ideals, and certainly idealized it. We see these wonderful scenes, floral scenes, very similar to the Primavera, that then became popular and continued to be popular for what the image of Florence is. So the good news is that Vernon Lee was successful. The demolition was halted, and not that urban planning didn't continue, but it certainly didn't continue from a destructive point of view. Her main argument really was, because she explains in her letter to the Times that certainly the ghetto area and that part of the center, it was called the sanification effort. And she was saying, certainly I'm not against sanification, but rather than sweeping out, rather than ventilating, rather than sanitizing, etc., what they actually did was eliminate this part of the city from the face of the earth. And what happened was, although the center of the city was saved, because obviously the foreign pressure was too great, the urban renewal was halted, and then an interesting, still journalistic campaign began in which journalists started to criminalize the Oltrarno area. You have to keep in mind that a lot of people who were evicted from the ghetto then moved to the Oltrarno, which was an area of the city which was characteristically poor, characteristically overcrowded. In fact, they say that military police squads were set up to patrol Ponte della Carraia because they didn't want the smelly individuals from the Sanfrediano area to enter into the center of the city, because it would be damaging to the city's image, particularly with so many foreign, such a large foreign presence. So imagine when these people who came out of the ghetto, who after perhaps several years would want to show their children where they had come from, etc., they weren't actually allowed to cross. A lot of times, if you look at the reputation, and right now I'm citing articles from 1901, the Sanfrediano district was branded the place where the police wouldn't go. And when they did show up, they would usually show up in groups of a dozen or more. So stories of the marginalization and the poverty of these people filled the papers, to prove that Piazza della Repubblica wasn't the only area of the city that needed to be saved from quote unquote ancient squalor. And I'm saying quote because, as you know, there's a plaque in the city to say, finally, the old ghetto was, revived or saved, rescued from ancient squalor. According to Giaro, who was a turn of the century columnist for La Nazione, the neighborhood was full of thieves who walked on rooftops the way you and I would walk on our living room floors. And he also said these people knew where to run, and while leaping from rooftop to rooftop, they would find others who would hold their hand out to them. So it's quite an interesting image. On the other hand, we also have to say that very possibly this campaign against the Oltrarno, and particularly the Sanfrediano district, was because, or it was triggered in part by city officials who eyed the area beyond the Arno as a pretty real estate package. So by portraying the district as criminal, they could more easily push out the large community, overhaul the urban landscape without much resistance from Florence's educated class. And they wanted to sort of conserve the sheen of Grand Tour Florence. And so at this point, the officials decided to restructure the Oltrarno. It was obviously further from the downtown, would garner less media attention. But also because if you think about the Oltrarno and that whole district, if you go Porta Romana and you're thinking of Via degli Seragli, for example, dei Seragli, it goes up to Bellosguardo. So it goes up to the villa, etc. What they wanted to do was create sort of high-end housing to match the palazzi, because the Oltrarno, as we know, in addition to Pitti, has many palazzi of the old nobles, of the old nobility of Florence. In reality, the urban planners didn't manage this either. and there are several reasons for that. One goes back to the economic issues that we were talking about before, and particularly are linked to craftsmanship. There was the awareness on some level that if the city lost its artisans, the city itself would be lost, because they really would not be able to salvage the valuable treasures that the artisans were producing. And certainly, you know, the Florentines at this time had not yet developed a love for their Renaissance past. But we have to imagine that this area was, you know, had been for 350 years, the district of artisans. We know that it continues to be the district of artisans. And recently with the Oltrarno Gays, we had the opportunity with creative people with the organization Creative People in Florence to go into workshops, working studios and ateliers, because the creativity in the Oltrarno district is certainly alive and well. So you have the paper makers and the potters and the mosaicists and the goldsmiths and the frame makers and carvers, etc., that were left to carry on the trades of their forefathers, that they had started practicing actually thanks to another woman who is Leonardo di Toledo. And I do want to point this out. I want to give a shout out to Leonardo di Toledo, who was obviously Cosimo I de' Medici's foreign wife, his Spanish wife. And the Pitti Palace, you'll remember, was bought thanks to her dowry. It was bought from the Medici rivals, the Pitti. And she was a brilliant woman. She maintained control over her dowry. And despite the fact that she lived in a world where women had no legal standing, she really dealt in money loaning. She ruled Florence when Cosimo I was away. And she was, in fact, instrumental to the development of the Oltrarno district, because in the year 1550, she decided that the Piazza della Signoria was not a proper home in which to raise her many children, and she found it unhealthy. And because of this, she decided that it would be best to bring them to the other side of the Arno, where there were gardens, and obviously she was instrumental in creating the Boboli gardens. And here we see, obviously, the portrait by Bronzino, one of the most famous portraits of Leonardo di Toledo. And she was a trendsetter. She was an influencer. We would call her an influencer today, because once they moved there, they needed craftsmen to decorate their palace, and engravers and skilled workers. The fact that the Medici dukes had moved their residence to this side of the river also meant that a lot of different families, noble families, would also construct their palazzi there. And so today we have a really interesting combination of amazing palazzi and noble families who continue to live, the ancestors continue to live in that area. And you have the, so there was this mix of extreme poverty, a mix of extreme creativity through the craftsmanship, and the presence of nobility who on some level wanted to be in that area, and on some level respected the identity of the craftsman. This is a photograph of the demolition, going back to the demolition we've been speaking about in our talk. And I mean, you have to consider, here I put the king of Rubble and his disciple. this is the million-dollar question: who was the king of Rubble? And I'm imagining that some of you know we're talking about Stefano Bardini, and his disciple is Elia Volpi, because these two antiquarians, collectors, and very mercantile individuals with a lot of sort of foresight, what they ended up doing was take advantage of the demolition to sort of collect capitals, paintings, ancient furniture, and from the medieval and Renaissance past, because basically they would go and pick through the ruins. And as I was saying before, the collective consciousness, the average person hadn't yet sort of come into their inheritance, let's put it that way. So what was discarded as rubbish, they actually took into their ateliers and started to create what was a new Florentine style. And Bardini in particular, and you can see evidence of this in Palazzo Bardini, which is obviously on the other side of the Arno in Piazza Mozzi, you can see how he starts putting together different pieces, creating pieces of antiquariato, or pieces of antiques, creating antique furniture, for example, by putting different pieces from different periods together. So it wasn't so much, that he was looking for historical authenticity. He was looking to create something that was aesthetically pleasing. If you look, for example, he was called the Prince of Antiquarians. I like the King of Rubble better in terms of his nickname, but they did certainly, both he and Elia Volpi, create this new style that really sort of made it important for foreigners. And Volpi in particular, he went to the United States, he had two game-changing auctions in 1910 and 1916, which prompted the rage for Florentine decor, and what Francesco Baldi calls his swift and secret restoration of Palazzo Davanzati, which he used then as a showroom for his antiquities. Certainly, Harold Acton in Villa La Pietra in the 1890s had ties with Elia Volpi, with his maestro. All of the collectors of the period were very much interested in the reconstruction of period interiors. So all of this is to discuss the image of Florence abroad. But now I want to take us back to the heart of the Oltrarno. Certainly, these are two images which I'll talk about in just a minute, but I wanted to first share a quote by actor and playwright Alessio Sardelli, who says, "San Frediano is the neighborhood of the joking people, the artisans pure and strong, rough and just blossomed, good-hearted and a bit rotten. They're ready for a fierce quip and the punch. Its people are always ready to roll up their sleeves and work or fight to the death if and when there is need." So those of you who, I know some people have a lot of experience with the Oltrarno, either as producing art there or living there, etc., and you can later verify if you find Alessio's statement to be accurate. Here we have, for example, the Nazi bombing of the area, and we have the bombing of the Ponte. It's interesting because when in 1945, the Florence was liberated, what they found was, when the Allies entered the city, what they found was that the Oltrarno area had already been liberated by the people. And this was an exception, because we are in fact talking about people with a lot of gumption. And I think it is their gumption that allows them to continue. And I do hope that in this time where artisans are going through difficulties, particularly because of the current situation and the lack of foreign guests, I really hope that they'll be able to be inspired to draw on their historic gumption. If we talk about, for example, the relationship between this fighting spirit of the Oltrarno and how Vernon Lee was related to it. But before we do that, I just want to show you this photograph on the right-hand side, which is chi ne metta, wait, let's see. Chi ha metta, chi non ha prenda. So he who has, put something, and he who doesn't have, take something. This was in the initial moments of the pandemic, of the lockdown. What we actually saw was a lot of these stands cropping up all over the Oltrarno. There's a lot of, it's an area with a history of solidarity. So there was the idea of, looking out for those in need, those going hungry, etc., and having what we can call a collective consciousness in this way. So one thing that I want to say about Vernon Lee as a fighting spirit, and I do want to go back to Henry James and to a particular critique that he made of her book, Miss Brown, in which she very much criticized, let's say, or her indirectly criticized through her cast of characters in her book, the pre-Raphaelites. She called the Rossetti clan the Poeticules, and there was a really scalding caricature of Dante Gabriele Rossetti, for example. But what he says in this, I want to relate to what we're talking about today. And he says, well, first he says, your hand has been too violent. The touch of life is lighter. But even more relevant to our discussion is, he says, cool first, right afterwards. Morality is hot, but art is icy. And I just think that first of all, as a writer, that's such an interesting way of talking about the craft, because writing does actually help you transform a hot situation, quote unquote. But I do think that it is because of her very almost heavy moral interest, almost unforgiving morality that does characterize a lot of her works and a lot of her essays, made it possible for her to be the one to sort of become the paladin for the center of Florence. She was also very interested in the Oltrarno area as well. So that's where we are. All the writers need to, I'm going to repeat it one more time. Cool first, right afterwards. Morality is hot, but art is icy. And I wanted to end here and to open the conversation with you. I'm interested in knowing your take on these images of Florence. We've gone through a lot of centuries, different years, different mediums, etc. But it's just to give you an idea really of how much the city is loved, continues to be loved, I'm certain, by those who are tuning in. So thank you for listening and for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Linda. That was a fascinating journey through a complex narrative to do with how the English colony interacted with the city as it was changing in the 100 years from the Firenze Capitale period. So thanks a lot for that. It was interesting to me, director of the Institute, that the British Institute comes very much out of that energy. That's where we started. Vernon Lee was associated with the Institute at its birth, but it wasn't exactly her. But other leaders of the English colony were working with their Florentine friends to put together a reading room and a cultural centre, which is what the institute became. So it's a Florentine institution from the go-get, and so we carry that baton forward, if you like, and what we're trying to do is position position the institute once more confidently as a Florentine institution, as a meeting point for the international and the Florentines in thinking about and preserving and taking the city forward. Hence the work we're doing with the friends in our project, and this latest one, To Remember to Listen, which I referred to at the beginning, as a collective act of community healing, if you like, given the terrible times we're going through in Florence at the moment. But as always, we throw it open now to questions and comments from anyone who is here who would like to join in. Rules of the game are very simple. You can either put something in the chat, which Linda or I will pick up for you, or else if you simply just unmute yourself and say something, that's also allowed and welcome. So over to you. Just gonna have a look at the chat. Somebody's asking you to give the last quote from Henry James one more time.
Yes. Let's see. What he says is, you have been too much in a moral passion. Cool first, right afterwards. Morality is hot, but art is icy.
Right.
Famous last word. Leave it to Henry James.
Yeah. Sometimes when you write a very angry email, it's a good idea to put it in the draft box and look at it again in the morning.
Indeed. Indeed.
You might change it rather than send it.
Let's see. I'm wondering, I'm not very good at looking at the chat, but maybe I should look at the chat and see if there's...
Well, I can read one out for you, Linda. Just come in from Sasha Samuels. My artisan friends in Florence have lamented how many of their studios have been replaced by pizzerias. It would be lovely to help subsidize them, as many are living treasures. What can we do to look after the bottega? Amen to that, and we should try to mobilize more forces to defend them, I would agree.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, and as Vernon Lee teaches us, it really is an awareness raising initiative. And I want to quote unquote beat a dead horse on that point. I mean, I think we really cannot underestimate the power of the individual. In fact, Vernon Lee said that you know, as soon as she well, let me rephrase that. The power of the individual as part of a collective. Because she was saying that, for example, she lost power just as an individual. And that's why she would appeal to a group. So if we can raise awareness, and hopefully the Oltrarno Gays program will do that. We have a last event, which will hopefully be, fingers crossed, an in-person event at the Conventino at the end of May, which is called Oltrarno Stories, in which we want the artisans to be able to tell their stories and draw on the energy of, similar to Simon, what you were saying before, to draw on the energy of their traditions via vignettes, because storytelling, you know, for humanity just in general is therapeutic. I mean, it's absolutely fundamental for us to continue conversations.
More in the chat, there's a couple of people asking if there's going to be a recording available. The answer is yes, we have a recording, and we will put it up on the British Institute's YouTube channel, and the link will be publicized in the What's On newsletter on Monday morning. So if you're not signed up for What's On, I suggest you do, because it contains all the information of everything that's going on at the British Institute. You'll also find it on the website. And I'll take the opportunity to thank everybody who's been making donations to support the Wednesday lecture program and keep the Institute afloat during this difficult time. As always, I will ask you if you would consider making a donation if you've enjoyed this evening's lecture. whatever sum you feel comfortable is welcome. Thanks to the generosity of our audience, the Institute is surviving. We'll continue to have a few challenges, but we're not going under a really difficult year. So thank you for anything you can do. A couple of thoughts about the artigiani. Somebody saying, go to them and buy their stuff. It's a good suggestion. Somebody else suggesting that it'd be great if they could have lower rents where possible. I would refer you to a group called Creative People in Florence, who are doing a lot of work to support the artigiani in a practical kind of way. Perhaps Sarah can put a link up to their website on the chat. What else have we got in the chat? It's coming through very fast.
Somebody was asking where she lived. Sorry, where she lived in Florence.
Yeah.
Where Vernon Lee lived. Initially, she lived more centrally, and Via Garibaldi was one of the locations. And then she moved to Il Palmerino, which is the last house in Florence. In fact, Federica, do you want to raise your hand so they can see where you are? That's Palmerino. That's in Palmerino where Federica is. You have to raise your hand so they can see you.
Yes.
Oh, there she is.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda, for this talk. And thank you for bring out the spirit of Vernon Lee that is always so contemporary, I think, and maybe can really give us a lot of, even now, I think, because there is even now issues in the city that need to be aware. So we don't have to forget her way to acting. And it's very important also how you show a little bit with the history, the image that the foreigner can give us Florentine and make us aware about, because it's always easier to see from the outside. When we are inside, is more, we are aware about too many things. So this is what I want to share with all of you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
In the chat, Brenda's asking how long it took from the time that Vernon Lee published her letter to the plan being dropped.
I think she worked on it for, I think it was within the year. Within a year, she had gathered her signatures and then liaisoned with the city administrators. Yeah. Timing was different. The city administrators at one point, particularly in the letter in the Nazione that Torrigiani wrote to Corsini, said that it actually wasn't true, that there wasn't money to do the demolition projects, etc. But Vernon Lee in her letter does describe that she went to visit him. They talked. He assured her that there was no plans to harm the Ponte Vecchio. And to prove his point, he called in an assistant architect, and the assistant architect actually said, no, we are planning to demolish this area and that area and the other area. So what Vernon Lee said was, I'm sorry to have to mention this because it obviously looks bad, but this is just to prove to you, that the city administrator isn't always the most informed about what is going on. And that's why we have to go directly to the people. And I mean, if I can just, make a plug for Advancing Women Artists on this, and just the experience that we've lived as mostly foreign donors, that the women who support Advancing Women Artists really, have found that bringing attention to an issue, and in our case it was art by women, bringing attention to that issue, has garnered international attention, huge international attention, for the same reason that Vernon Lee got international attention the issue of art by women and rediscovering and restoring art by women has gained international attention. That means that, you know, after 15 years of talking, the museums themselves are now very actively, you know, making efforts to reclaim their property by women and to give more attention to this side of their collections. And so it does make a difference. I mean, you know, awareness raising, and this can be traced back to the artisans as well. You know, what can we do for the artisans? Awareness raising, you know, and then we'll purchase their things, but you have to know who they are. And I agree with you, Simon. Creative people in Florence are doing a wonderful job from that point of view, you know, with your partnership as well. And so I'm just very grateful for this lesson that Vernon Lee continues to give.
Diane Archibald, we'll come to you in a moment, Alice. Diane Archibald writes in the chat, on a local level, there was also strong reaction at that time from notable Florentine architects and engineers, and there continues to be a strong reaction by architects to the destruction of the medieval centre. So though the Vernon leading the international pressure, there was a strong movement within the Florentines themselves. So Alice, what did you want to say?
Oh, I just wanted to ask Linda if she could talk a little bit about the Oltrarno gaze, because I know just from the chat that a lot of people are very interested in helping the artisans, and I think it would be nice if the audience knew a little bit more about what that project is.
Sure. The Oltrarno gaze was, it actually started with an exhibition up at Palmerino after the after the initial lockdown, and it was summertime, and Federica and I were talking about, and Federica, you can chime in anytime, but just to give your testimony on this level, she was saying, you know, that she had lived through a really almost idyllic, almost Boccaccio-esque lockdown up in the hills, and she was really missing, you know, the real Florence, the neuralgic center of Florence, and where the real people live. In fact, it's interesting that even now, when you go to the center of Florence, you see the historic center is very empty, but the Oltrarno area is more or less normal, because that's where the normal people are, where the working people are, etc. It's not as visually, it's not as affected. Like where is everybody? Because the million tourists are not in the center. You really see a difference in the center. But it started there. It started with the exhibition of portraits of the Oltrarno by an American painter, Victoria Schlichter, who is an expat and living in the district. And she started doing portraiture about you know, her neighbors. So all levels of society, from, you know, even homeless people and people who she came in contact with, etc. And from there was such a nice response to the program. We started asking ourselves, you know, how can we do something for the artisans? And we started with an awareness raising project, which was conferences. We have one the beginning of next month, which is called the Oltrarno Then and Now, in which we're going to be talking to several historic institutions, the Istituto dei Bardi, for example, and the Artigianelli, OMA, which is the Osservatorio di Arti Mestieri. So different realities that are working with artisans in the Oltrarno now. We also organized a grant program for young students studying at the Porta Romana Istituto d'Arte, and for them to do with local studios, and in this case, Studio Puck in the Oltrarno area, different works of art, engraving and graphic works. And we're going to be doing up at Palmerino a show by visit, so small groups. So those who are in Florence can go up, they get the summertime walk or springtime walk, can see the results of that show. And it was really important because these young people who in any case are studying at the Istituto d'Arte, they don't get a lot of hands-on craftsmanship. So for based on the participants and what they have said, there were 5 grant winners, and they said it was really a life-changing experience for them, especially in a time where they're doing a lot of online education. So for them to actually be able to go to the artigianelli, to do paper making, to learn the process, etc. So it's the Oltrarno Gaze is a combination of conferences, of events. We have obviously the patronage of the British Institute, the patronage of the U.S. Consulate, who are very supportive, and with Simon particularly, we've linked up with creative people in Florence who just did a wonderful, and I believe it's still online. No, the wonderful. It's a wonderful program where we visited different studios in the Oltrarno. So on the British Institute YouTube and then creative people in Florence, you can look that up. Really uplifting. It was a really, really uplifting event. Yes, so hopefully this is an element that will continue in the future. Edition 1, 2021, and we're looking to make it happen for 2022 as well. Perhaps from another point of view, etc. But it's very important to hear the artisans' stories. I don't know, Alice, if you want to add something to that as well, but it's a big program. You can you can go onto AWA's website and look at the program. Unfortunately, the dates have been changed because we're still trying to figure out how to make it happen. But
yeah, no, the only thing I would add is that I think there's a very real possibility that it will go on for at least another year. Yeah. And we're hoping for a lot longer than that.
Evviva.
Yeah, at the British Institute, we are very happy to be involved with this and supportive of it. And we're actually trying to develop a stronger dialogue with the Comune about how to support contemporary creativity in the Centro Storico. Because there's a real danger that Centro Storico has been hollowed out as a wonderful museum of heritage, and a lot of the arts activity tends to be of the classical heritage variety. And there's not the space that there used to be in Florence for the more contemporary creative practice. So we are actually developing a program right now with the Assessore alla Cultura to look at that issue and see if we can get some traction. So yeah, we're in this game and in our neighborhood, Oltrarno, and want to play, definitely. Any more? We've come towards the hour and a half, which is normally our natural time limit. I'm not going anywhere special. If anyone's got anything more that they need desperately to say, so I'll give one more chance for people to unmute and speak or put something. If not, gone. It remains for me just to thank one more time, Linda, on behalf of everyone. You can tell from the chat, people have had a really good time. And so thanks, everyone. It's been another great night. And we will see you all next week, if not before. And we're getting there. We're in Zona Giallo now, and I can attest that Monday evening, the first night when the restaurants were allowed to be serving out of doors again, that Piazza Santo Spirito was a zoo. So there might not have been many tourists around, but there were plenty locals, I'm telling you. Florence, it's my pleasure to welcome you.